Lions Nation, full attention. We've reached a point where sugarcoating the reality would be disrespectful to those who follow this team snap by snap. Detroit Lions fans deserve honesty, and the truth hurts. What we're witnessing isn't just a brief slump or bad luck piling up at the wrong time. It's something deeper, something structural. Anyone who lives through every drive, every failed third down stop, every defensive breakdown can feel it in their gut. Winning football simply isn't showing up, and the defense has become the symbol of this collapse. The loss to the Steelers wasn't just another mark in the loss column. It stamped a trend that's been growing, getting louder, and becoming impossible to ignore. This video is for those who love this franchise, respect the history of the Lions, and understand that facing reality is the first step toward changing the future. This is a direct, intense, and necessary conversation, the way Detroit fans know how to handle it. If you feel this moment demands accountability, awareness, and real discussion, stay with me until the end. And don't forget to hit the like button to support the content and show that Lions Nation doesn't run from the truth. The numbers are brutal, and they are not opinions. Over the last 2 games alone, the Lions defense has allowed more than 1,000 total yards. That is not a typo. 1,000 yards surrendered in a 2-game span. In the entire history of this franchise, that has happened only 4 times, and the other 3 came during seasons that still haunt this fan base. 2008, 2020, and 2021. Those were years defined by dysfunction, rebuilds, and historically bad football. Anytime the current team is mentioned in the same breath as those seasons, alarms should be blaring inside Allen Park. Extend the sample size and it somehow gets worse. Over the last 5 games, the Lions defense has allowed 2,293 yards. That averages out to nearly 459 yards per game. This is the most yards allowed over any 5-game stretch since the end of the 2020 season. 5 straight games allowing at least 350 yards is not just bad defense. It's a systemic failure to get off the field. It means long drives, exhausted players, an offense watching from the sideline, and a team constantly playing from behind in time of possession. Against the Steelers, that reality was on full display in the third quarter, when Pittsburgh ran 28 plays and the Lions' offense ran 6. That is a game being taken away from you, possession by possession, snap by snap. What makes this sting even more is that this roster is not devoid of talent. This isn't a stripped-down expansion-level unit. There are good players on this defense, and earlier in the season, they showed they could play at a high level. That's why this collapse feels so jarring. The conversation around coaching has naturally intensified, but it's important to be precise. Kelvin Shepherd is not some incompetent placeholder. He is a young coordinator who had this unit performing far better earlier in the year. But the last month has been disastrous, and pretending otherwise helps no one. Adjustments haven't worked. Run fits have been blown. The defensive line has been pushed around, even by backup linemen. That is where frustration turns into accountability. The loss of Terrell Williams looms large right now. Last year's defensive line coach is now gone, and the impact is undeniable. This current group is not winning at the line of scrimmage. Against Pittsburgh, that weakness was exposed relentlessly, even with the Steelers dealing with injuries along their offensive line. The Lions have cycled through defensive line coaches year after year, and once again, that room feels unsettled and ineffective. Whether that leads to changes remains to be seen, but the tape is unforgiving. Individually, Pro Football Focus grades from the Steelers game tell a revealing story. On defense, the lowest-graded players included Marcus Davenport, Alex Anzalone, Tyree Wilson, and Devontae Maddox. Tyree Wilson, in particular, continues to raise uncomfortable questions. As a first-round pick, expectations do not require superstardom, but they do require impact. Right now, his name simply isn't being called enough during games. On the other side, there were bright spots. Jack Campbell stood out with a 16-tackle performance and the highest defensive grade on the team. Roy Lopez graded extremely well, as did Thomas Harper and DJ Reader. Those performances matter, but they are islands in a sea of inconsistency.
Offensively, the grades reflect a unit that did enough to win if it had any help. Khalif Raymond was the highest-graded offensive player, providing a spark and finding the end zone. Jared Goff graded solidly, and the offensive line, while not dominant, was not the problem. Christian Mahogany struggled in extended snaps, clearly showing rust, and the run game never fully found its rhythm. Still, this loss does not fall at the feet of the offense. Then there's the conversation that never should have happened but did. Aiden Hutchinson's post-game comments about officiating struck a nerve, not because fans disagree that questionable calls happened, but because leaders cannot let the narrative go there. Hutchinson is the face of this defense. He is its best player and one of its emotional pillars. When the defense gives up 230 rushing yards and allows drive after drive to bleed the clock, the message has to be ownership, not frustration with referees. Amon-Ra St. Brown said it plainly, the push-off was his mistake, and it didn't cost them the game. That mindset matters. Games should never come down to desperation laterals and miracle attempts when defensive stops were available all afternoon and never made. At 8-7, the Lions are staring at reality. This is the first time since 2022 they have lost 2 straight games, and their playoff chances are slipping away, now dependent not only on winning out but also on help from other teams. That alone should not define the season, but the way these losses have unfolded absolutely does. This isn't about tearing everything down. The window is not closed. There are foundational players here. But this stretch has been a reality check, exposing issues that were not adequately addressed and problems that can no longer be dismissed as bad luck or injuries. So as this season reaches its most critical point, the question becomes unavoidable. Do you believe this is simply a brutal slump that can be corrected quickly, or are we witnessing warning signs of deeper problems that must be addressed immediately? What do you think is the real root of this defensive collapse? What happens next will define how this season is remembered, and maybe even how the direction of this team is judged moving forward. Because when you strip away the emotions, the frustration, and the noise around officiating or outside distractions, what remains is a team that has failed in the most basic area required to win in the NFL. Stopping the other team. You can survive missed calls. You can survive injuries. You cannot survive giving up nearly 460 yards per game over a 5-week stretch and expecting to control outcomes. One of the most concerning elements in all of this is how familiar it feels to longtime Lions fans. Not because the roster lacks talent, but because the warning signs mirror past failures. The defense has now produced 4 separate streaks of allowing at least 350 yards per game during the Dan Campbell era. That does not erase the progress made, but it does demand serious introspection. The biggest complaint from fans during this regime has consistently been the same: the inability to get stops when it matters most. Third downs, late drives, and games that hinge on one possession have repeatedly gone the wrong way. Against the Steelers, that reality was unavoidable. Pittsburgh imposed its will physically, ran the football at will, and controlled tempo. The Lions' defense knew what was coming and still could not stop it. That is the definition of being outplayed. When a team with backup linemen can dictate terms for 4 quarters, the problem is not scheme alone. It is execution, leverage, discipline, and depth. And that responsibility does not fall on one coach or one player. It belongs to the entire operation. Kelvin Shepard's situation reflects that complexity. Earlier in the season, this defense showed energy, aggression, and cohesion. Over the last month, it has unraveled. That does not mean the answer is to panic and fire coaches midstream. It does mean adjustments have to be real, not cosmetic. Personnel usage, rotational decisions, and situational calls must improve immediately. This defense has been placed in advantageous situations by the offense and still failed to capitalize. The defensive line remains a glaring concern. The absence of Terrell Williams has been felt week after week, and the current group has not filled that void. Pressure has been inconsistent, edge containment has broken down, and interior resistance has been soft far too often. Aiden Hutchinson continues to battle, picking up sacks and playing through constant attention, but even he cannot compensate for systemic breakdowns around him. When the run defense collapses, the entire structure follows. On the player side, there's also a looming sense of transition. Several veterans are nearing the end of their contracts, and performances like the one against Pittsburgh only accelerate difficult decisions. PFF grades don't tell the full story, but they confirm what the eye test shows. Some players are rising to the challenge, like Jack Campbell, who continues to develop into a centerpiece linebacker with instincts, range, and leadership. Others are failing to justify their roles or draft status. Those evaluations will shape the offseason, regardless of how the final 2 games unfold. The offense, meanwhile, is being forced into a near-perfect standard just to keep games competitive. That is not sustainable. Jared Goff cannot be expected to overcome long stretches of inactivity while the defense bleeds clock. Skill players cannot stay sharp when drives are scarce. Football is complementary by nature, and right now, that balance is broken. Then there are the distractions, moments that steal focus when the team can least afford it. The incident involving DK Metcalf and a fan became a national talking point, but it should never have happened in the first place. Fans have a responsibility. Players have boundaries. When lines are crossed, everyone loses. None of that helps the Lions win football games, and none of it changes the reality on the field. What remains is a narrow path forward. The Lions must win their remaining games and hope for help elsewhere. That is the math. But beyond standings and percentages, these final weeks are about answers. Who responds when the season teeters on the edge? Who elevates their play when excuses are gone? Who proves they are part of the solution and not another chapter in a familiar cycle? This team does not need to be blown up. The window is still open, but windows do not stay open forever, and seasons like this one leave marks. How the Lions finish will matter, not just in the standings, but in how trust is rebuilt with a fan base that has seen this story before and desperately wants a different ending. And that's why these next moments, these next decisions, are heavier than just the final score of a season that is slipping away. What you are watching right now is not only a team fighting for a playoff spot, but an organization being forced to confront the gap between expectation and execution. The Lions talked all offseason about taking the next step, about no longer being satisfied with progress, about becoming a team that dictates terms. Over the last 5 weeks, they have been dictated to. The hardest part for fans to accept is that this isn't coming from nowhere. The signs were there. Close games that required late heroics. Defensive drives that stretched far too long. Opponents converting third downs with ease. Those things pile up, and eventually they collapse into what we are seeing now. When a defense allows 5 straight opponents to reach at least 350 yards, it stops being a coincidence and becomes an identity problem. What makes this stretch even more painful is that it has wasted legitimate growth from individual players. Jack Campbell's emergence as a true middle linebacker is real. He is diagnosing plays faster, finishing tackles, and becoming a stabilizing presence in the middle. Khalif Raymond continues to maximize his opportunities, providing spark and reliability when called upon. Jared Goff, despite criticism, has largely done his job within the structure of the offense. These performances deserve to be part of a winning story, not footnotes and losses defined by defensive breakdowns. Instead, the defense keeps pulling the team back into the same gravity that has swallowed past Lions seasons. It doesn't matter how modern the offense looks or how aggressive the mindset is if stops never come. It doesn't matter how much effort is shown if fundamentals fail. Gap integrity, tackling, leverage, and communication are not optional at this level, and right now they are inconsistent at best. The comments after the Steelers game revealed a team that knows it is struggling, but still hasn't fully embraced accountability in the right places. When conversations drift toward officiating, distractions, or bad luck, it signals frustration without resolution. The truth is simpler and harsher. This team has been run on, worn down, and outplayed for extended stretches. Until that changes, no amount of motivation or belief will flip results. The front office will eventually have to answer for how this roster was constructed on defense. The coaching staff will have to answer for why adjustments haven't stuck, and players will have to answer for their individual performances, especially those expected to be cornerstones. None of that requires panic, but all of it requires honesty. These final games are no longer just about sneaking into the postseason. They are auditions. They are evaluations. They are statements about who belongs in the next phase of this build. Every snap matters because every snap is being judged. So as this season reaches its most uncomfortable point, the conversation shifts from hope to clarity. What kind of team are the Lions really becoming? Is this defensive collapse a temporary failure or a warning that bigger changes are needed? And even beyond the scheme, beyond the names on the depth chart, there's a psychological weight that starts to show up when this keeps happening. Defenses that can't get stops begin to press. Linebackers hesitate instead of reacting. Safeties creep forward and get caught out of position. Pass rushers try to win on their own instead of trusting the structure. You could see it against Pittsburgh. The urgency was there, but the confidence wasn't. And in the NFL, when confidence disappears, execution follows it right out the door. That's why the third quarter of that game matters so much in how this season will be remembered. 28 Steelers plays to 6 Lions plays is not just a bad stretch. It's a warning sign. It tells you the defense could not get off the field in obvious situations. It tells you the offense had no rhythm because it was constantly cooling down. And it tells you the opponent knew exactly what it wanted to do and never felt threatened while doing it. Those are the moments where good teams respond with toughness. Right now, the Lions are responding with survival mode. This is also where leadership gets tested in ways that don't show up in box scores. Veterans have to pull younger players together. Coaches have to simplify without dumbing things down. Players have to stop worrying about mistakes and start trusting fundamentals again. You don't fix a defense giving up this many yards with one clever call or one emotional speech. You fix it with discipline, repetition, and accountability. And that takes time the Lions no longer have this season. What makes this especially frustrating is that the margin for error was already razor thin. At 8-7, every snap is essentially a playoff snap. There is no cushion left. There's no figure it out next week. Every blown tackle, every missed assignment, every third and long conversion allowed feels like it carries double weight. And when playoff odds shrink to single digits, the pressure becomes suffocating. Still, this is not a hopeless roster. That part matters. There are building blocks here that teams spend years trying to find. There's a quarterback who can operate the offense. There are young defenders who are growing into real contributors. There's a coaching staff that has shown it can elevate a team from the bottom of the league. But this moment demands evolution, not comfort. What worked before is not working now, and refusing to acknowledge that is how seasons quietly die. The Lions are being forced to confront who they are under stress. Not when things are rolling, not when momentum is on their side, but when the flaws are exposed and the answers are uncomfortable. That confrontation is unavoidable now. The tape doesn't lie, the numbers don't lie, and the standings don't lie. So as we watch how this plays out, remember this isn't just about wins and losses anymore. It's about whether this team can stare its biggest weakness in the face and respond like a contender, or whether it falls back into patterns that fans know all too well. And when you zoom out even further, what becomes impossible to ignore is how thin the margin is between progress and regression in this league. The Lions are living in that space right now. One side of it is everything this fan base has invested in over the last few years: toughness, belief, culture, and the idea that this team is no longer an easy out. The other side is the reality that the NFL punishes any weakness it detects, and right now the Lions' defense is being targeted, stressed, and exposed week after week. This is where the conversation about culture meets the cold edge of results. Culture does not replace execution. Effort does not erase missed fits. Energy does not compensate for losing at the line of scrimmage. Those things matter, but they only matter when paired with discipline and consistency. Against the Steelers, there were moments of fight, moments of resistance, but not enough sustained structure to change the flow of the game. That's the difference between hanging around and taking control.